Hi, welcome to another video of GeoSpinach. Today we're going to talk about World War I trenches and how they work, and a linear defensive system. Now, to understand before we start, World War I trenches and the way they developed is the applicability of a linear defense system. And in the end of the video, we're going to analyze why an army will choose to use a linear defense system. Now, let's look the World War I specifically. So we're going to dive into depth specifically on how a trench system is planned, is worked, and how they actually fought in World War I, just for you to get an idea behind it. So here, as you can see, you have the trenches and the connecting, and the map might be a bit confusing, but let's get over each part individually. Now, firstly, we have the artillery position. Now the artillery position, it's always lying on the back, so it's staying as far as possible from the front lines on 10-20 kilometers away, just enough to be able to provide artillery support but not to be overrun. Then you have the communication trenches. The communication trenches are these things. And the reason you have those communication trenches is because in World War I battlefields, your troops will receive quite a lot of artillery power and artillery fire on top of them. And those trenches, which are smaller than the normal trenches, the probability that the shell is going to actually hit the trench is very, very small. So a trench that looks like this, for example, an artillery shell will hit here, here, and the troops will be safe. The probability that it will actually hit within the trench is quite small, and the reason the trenches are built in this diagonal manner is to protect from the blast of the artillery shell if they are unlucky and it shoots through. Thus, the communication trenches tend to be much shorter to protect as much as possible the troops passing through. Then you have the reserve trench, which is more linear and much bigger and even more deeper for troops to sleep in. Of course, they sleep in the front trenches as well, but here is more luxurious, let's say, for the standards of the First World War. Then you have more concrete block houses. So these are machine gun posts that have multiple machine guns on and act as strong points in the defensive system. And they usually are behind the second line, although in many cases you could have find them in the first line. The reason you avoid to put them in the first line is not to be destroyed directly by artillery fire. And then you have the supportive trench, which is in general all of this line of trenches. So this support trench is similar to the first trench, but it's just few less than a kilometer behind. And again, this is much wider than a support trench, and it's there for troops to lie and able to support and fire. And then you have the machine gun positions, which are positions within the trenches, but with much more reinforcement as to protect again from artillery fire as well as small arms fire. And the angle I show here is the angle of attack, because imagine much older machine guns that you set up, it's much harder to turn around, so there is a limited angle where they hit, while in the block houses is a much bigger angle. Then you have the frontline trench that passes along the line, which is the trench that the actual combat is going to take into and where it hosts the troops fighting. Throughout this system, there are in-depth, so going much deeper for the housing of the troops, the relative housing of the troops. Now, this, for example, is a machine gun position, as the ones that I show over here. Then you have the barbed wire, which is there to delay the troops as they moving, the enemy troops. And then you also have the observation and advanced trenches. These trenches have dual uses. Firstly, are much, much thinner, and in many cases they are not even considered trenches. It's just for troops to be a bit closer to the no man's land and be able to observe the enemy and be able to snipe the enemy, as well as act as a gateway for troops to pass through into the battlefield. And above, we have the no man's land. And now the system is built as to provide a relative kill zone in the top, so not as effective because it's a bit longer in range. So imagine half a kilometer away, 400 meters away. Then you have a much closer kill zone. So we're talking about 100 to 200 meters. So in this area, the kill zone becomes much more devastating. The troops are completely entangled in the barbed wire, especially if it's not cut and they start receiving casualties. And then we have the immediate kill zone. In the immediate kill zone, you have your majority defending troops fire all of their munitions on the enemy. The enemy is delayed by the barbed wire and practically gets slaughtered. And now let's see practical examples of trench warfare. So firstly, we're going to see an advance, how you use a linear advance system. So you have your platoons already in the front range, and then some in the secondary and some in the reserve. Now, the idea of a linear defense and offense position is that you attack in a linear manner. It's the simplest form to attack in modern warfare. Yes, it's not very effective, but it's really easy to apply. Now, the idea is that you have your first wave, and that's the first line you observe here, moving across. Then you have your secondary wave moving into better positions, and then reinforcements coming in. And then after your first troops have crossed the no man's land and start pushing in across the front line, you set up your second wave, and your second wave launches its attack, and then you have the reserve, so the third wave moving in to finish the job. We've seen how much that worked in the First World War, but there are many other variables in the First World War that made the war practically ineffective. And the trench system is what made the war ineffective in regards to offensive capabilities, because the trench system itself, it was so brilliant in defense and so brilliant anti-artillery. So that's the essence of the trench system, that it truly protects you from artillery fire, that made the defense much, much stronger than any offense. So if we see my other videos on firepower and breakthrough, you have a scenario of very good defense, that you can maintain very good organization, you can maintain very high firepower, but the enemy during World War II, they had very little actual breakthrough ability. And because of a linear defense system, I'm going to talk a bit later, where you have a massive concentration of troops on the front line, breakthroughing that concentration of troops is much, much harder, especially without using tanks. Now, let's see the inverse. How do you apply in defense in a linear defensive system? The way you apply defense is you have less sparse troops on the frontal trenches and more troops in the secondary and reserve trenches. And the reason you do that is because you expect a massive artillery barrage by the enemy. So even if the trenches by themselves protect the troops, you expect the majority of the artillery barrage to come to the first trench line. So you want as less troops as possible at that line as to minimize your casualties. And as the enemy advances, so here you see the enemy advances, your troops from the secondary line move to the first line to reinforce that position, and at the same time your artillery open fires and starts shooting at the moving enemy troops. As those enemy troops come in, this is the first wave of the enemy, and this is the second wave of the enemy, they reach into the kill zone, your reinforcements are coming in, and you expect a fight to occur over here. Now, whether they overtake the trench or not, it really matters on the situation on the field. There is no one concrete way to do it. Now, this system can also be applied in modern warfare at some degree by applying some anti-tank trenches and anti-tank obstacles, as for example we see currently Ukraine. So the concept of anti-tank trenches is that here you masquerade here. So there's a bush or something here. So when the tank comes, it doesn't see anything. And then the tank ends up falling into the trench, and then it becomes useless by terrain. And then you just hit it from a gun position from behind. That's the concept of an anti-tank trench. Uh, tooths, block tooths, let's say, are built in a way to just make it impossible for tanks to cross over. And you have to destroy them, but it's quite hard to do because they're concrete. Now, the concepts of a linear defense system and how you in general apply it is based on to prevent a breakthrough by concentrating as much of a defense across the enemy line. So all of the troops are concentrated on that front line. It's easier for resource allocation because you distribute resources equally across the troops. The issue is that you don't actually have no reserves remaining because all of your troops are literally on the front line. There is very limited flexibility within the system because, again, all the troops are on the front line. So you can't really respond to any flanking maneuvers. And it really depends on the terrain whether you are capable of using it. But in many cases, natural terrains favor linear defensive systems. So if you have a river, for example, you might opt out of using a double defensive system, so limiting your troops on the front line, because the river is such a good defensive line by itself that if you put your whole amount of your troops on the river, then the chances for the enemy breaking through are much lower than dividing your troops by having a secondary line and having a reserve and having the flexibility, but then allowing the enemy to actually cross the river. Because then you lose the river, which if you lose the river, you guarantee lose the war, then a linear defensive system much better to use. In comparison with defense in depth, for example, it's way less flexible and adaptable. There is a uniform distribution, and as we mentioned, so the troops are placed evenly across the field. And if there is a favorable terrain, as we have mentioned, it's actually quite useful. Now, in practicality, this is in zoom out in a brigade level how it looks. So the linear defense offense system is used if you have overwhelming numbers. So if you are so confident of victory that you're like, I'm just going to put my troops across the front line, start marching in, and no chances for enemies to do outflanking me and anything. Even if he concentrates his troops, I'm just going to storm in. This system, while simplistic in essence, it's incorporated in other attacking systems as well. For example, it is incorporated in the Russian way of war, in the deep battle system, where once you break the enemy line and you push forward, eventually I'm going to make specifically a lot of videos about the Russian system of war, but when you break through, you just move across the front line. That's the concept, just capture as much territory as you can in an open manner. So that's an application of a linear offensive system. The other negative use, you use it as a desperate defense. The reason we mentioned the river, you are massively outnumbered, so it's like 1v5. You're guaranteed gonna lose any type of system you apply, assuming you don't have a super army. So the only way for you to be able to work is to concentrate all of your troops using favorable terrain and in a single line, just to be able to avoid that breakthrough. And if that breakthrough happens, well, anyway, you lost. So why use it? And again, there are other reasons, such as lack of advanced operations. So if your army of advanced combined arms, so if the quality of your troops and the quality of your officer corps and the quality of your infantry, which is the case in the majority of the countries in the world, is generally very low, using a very advanced and complex defense and offense system might lead to more disadvantages rather than advantages. So in many cases, much easier to just use a much simplistic system that might be more effective rather than using a more complex system. Like many armies are just incapable of using more complex systems, as we've seen, for example, from the Iraq-Iran war, where they started using more advanced systems, let's say, in the start of the war, but eventually they just ended up using trench warfare and wave after wave attacks because they were just capable, truly incapable of applying any other method of offensive. And well, the Frontline didn't move as much, but nonetheless, it to apply any other system except the linear defense and offensive system, then you come some requirements in quality of officers and the training of your troops. Something you should never forget. You can always imagine that you can have an optimal system of defense, but you have to come to the reality of the world, the actual reality of your army. As Sun Tzu said, to know yourself, you have to know yourself to know the enemy to win 100 battles. So it's really important to understand how good your army is to understand what type of defensive systems you apply. I'm going to make videos eventually about all types of defense and offensive ways and maneuvers. This has been the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any ideas, questions, and things you want me to talk about, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for watching.